December night cut through Manhattan with a sharpness that only winter could deliver. The kind of cold that made even the glittering city lights feel distant and unforgiving. Alexander Richardson stepped out of Lirin, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, with the same mechanical precision he carried into every part of his life. At 38, his existence was a well-oiled machine, empires built, markets conquered, acquisitions sealed before competitors even realized the opportunity existed. Tonight had been no different. The deal he'd finalized over dinner would add another billion-dollar company to the towering structure of Richardson Industries. His cashmere coat fell perfectly over his tailored suit. His Swiss watch confirmed the time down to the second, and he knew his Bentley would be at the curb within exactly 3 minutes. His life was measured, calculated, predictable just as he preferred it. The sound of the city swirled around him, taxi horns, distant sirens, the crunch of shoes on salted sidewalks. He barely noticed any of it. He lived above the noise, above the chaos, separated from it by the invisible wall of his empire. His world was numbers on screens and signatures on contracts, not the messy human reality that moved in shadows along the streets of New York. And then he heard it, a voice, soft and fragile, cutting into his routine like an unexpected note in a perfectly rehearsed symphony. Please, just a little food. At first it barely registered. The city was full of need, full of desperate hands reaching from corners he never allowed himself to look at for too long. He had built walls against it, convincing himself that his philanthropic foundation, the millions he gave away in neat, tax-friendly packages, was his contribution. He could not help everyone. That was the line he had repeated so many times it had become truth in his mind. Anything helps, please. This time the words cracked through the armor of his indifference. There was something in the voice, an echo of dignity clinging to desperation, that drew his eyes to the side, against his better judgment. He turned, intending only a fleeting glance, but the sight stopped him in place. A woman sat huddled against the restaurant's outer wall, her thin frame wrapped around a bundle of blankets. Her clothes were worn, but meticulously clean, as if she fought daily against surrendering the last scraps of pride. But it wasn't her condition that caught him. It wasn't even the child shifting weakly in her arms. It was the glimmer at her throat. For a moment, he thought the cold was playing tricks on him, that the streetlight had bent itself strangely against a piece of cheap jewelry. But no, the longer he looked, the harder his heart hammered in his chest. The necklace wasn't cheap. It wasn't possible. A strand of South Sea pearls, each one perfectly matched, held together by a diamond and sapphire clasp that shone like frozen fire. He knew that necklace. He had seen it in photographs of his grandmother, in the secure vault of his family estate, in the carefully guarded stories of Richardson tradition. That necklace wasn't simply jewelry, it was legacy. It was supposed to have been passed down only to true Richardson family, and it had been missing for years. His breath froze in his throat. The woman holding the child wore it. His first instinct was disbelief. Perhaps it was a forgery, a cruel imitation, but deep inside, Alexander knew authenticity when he saw it. The clasp was unmistakable. That necklace was real. His world, so neatly constructed, wavered on its axis. He took a step closer, his polished shoes crunching softly against the salted pavement. The woman must have felt his gaze, for she looked up, her tired eyes catching his. And in that instant, recognition so faint yet undeniable flashed between them. Before he could form words, the bundle in her arms stirred. The baby turned its head, blinking against the cold, its face illuminated under the yellow glow of the street lamp. Tiny features, fragile yet strikingly familiar. And then Alexander saw them, the eyes, not just green, but that particular shade of deep emerald, a color that had marked every generation of his bloodline. His father had them. His grandmother had them. He himself saw them every morning in the mirror. The child stared back at him with those same Richardson eyes. The night, once orderly and predictable, suddenly split open. Suspense slithered into the air around him, chilling him more than the winter wind. Could it be? Could fate, cruel and precise, have placed before him not only his family's lost treasure, but also his own blood? For the first time in years, Alexander Richardson, a man who lived by control, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The street around them seemed to vanish, the yellow glow of the lamps, the glimmer of snowflakes drifting like tiny shards of glass, the muffled sounds of traffic, they all faded into a kind of silence that pressed against Alexander's ears. He stood frozen, his pulse thundering, his gaze locked on the impossible sight before him. The pearls, the baby, those emerald eyes. His mind rejected it even as his chest recognized the truth. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, but his throat tightened until the only word that slipped free was a name. He had not spoken in years. Olivia. Her head snapped up at the sound of it, and the reaction on her face was like a knife twisting. In his chest, recognition flickered there, followed instantly by fear. She pulled the child closer, as though Alexander himself were a threat, and scrambled to rise. The motion was clumsy, born of exhaustion and malnutrition, but the fire in her eyes burned with the same intensity he remembered from the past. He had not seen her in 2 years. 2 years of convincing himself she was gone for good. 2 years of rationalizing her disappearance, telling himself she had been unworthy, unstable, uninterested, that she had left because she couldn't handle his world. He had buried the sting of her absence under boardroom victories and market expansions, silencing the hollow ache by adding commas to his net worth. And yet here she was, on a freezing Manhattan sidewalk, wearing his grandmother's necklace and holding a baby that bore his family's eyes. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, more accusation than question. Olivia straightened her back despite the cold, despite the poverty etched into her posture. "I could ask you the same," she said bitterly, "but then again, you've always belonged here. Marble floors, velvet ropes, and champagne that costs more than rent. And me?" She shook her head. "I don't belong anywhere anymore." Alexander stepped closer, his breath visible in the frigid air. "That necklace, where did you get it?" Her hand flew instinctively to her throat, fingers curling protectively over the pearls. "You know where I got it," she said softly, her voice low and dangerous, as if daring him to deny the truth. The answer roared through his memory. He remembered that night, the night he had unlocked his family's vault for the first time, when he had placed those pearls around her neck in a rare moment of vulnerability. He had told her the necklace was only given to the woman who truly became family. And then she was gone. His chest tightened, fury and longing colliding in violent waves. "You disappeared without a word," he whispered, his voice trembling. 2 years, Olivia, and now I find you here, begging, wearing that?" His eyes dropped to the child, and him. The bundle in her arms shifted, and the little boy looked up again, meeting Alexander's gaze with unnerving calm. The features were undeniable now, the cleft chin, the high cheekbones, the unmistakable spark in those green eyes. Alexander's heart stopped. He took a step back as if the revelation itself had physically struck him. "No," he breathed. "It can't be." The baby reached out a small hand toward him, gurgling softly. Olivia adjusted her grip and pulled the child closer, away from his reach. "Don't," she said quickly, her voice breaking. "Is he mine?" The words tore out of him, rough and desperate, unlike anything Alexander Richardson had ever said before. The man who had silenced investors, outmaneuvered politicians, and dominated entire markets now sounded like a child begging for an answer. Olivia's lips parted, and for a long moment she said nothing. The only sound was the wind cutting through the narrow street. Finally, her voice came, quiet but searing. "His name is Ethan," she said. "And yes, he's yours." Alexander staggered, his breath catching in his throat. He tried to summon logic, calculations, proof, anything to anchor himself. But numbers meant nothing against the sight of the boy, a son. He had a son, 20 months old, by the look of him. 20 months of first words, first steps, first laughter, all moments stolen from him. The rage flared. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice cracked like a whip, sharp enough that Olivia flinched. "I tried," she snapped, her composure shattering. "Do you think I wanted this life? Do you think I wanted to raise him alone? I called, Alexander. I called your office 13 times until your assistant told me never to call again. I stood in the rain outside your building, 7 months pregnant, and your doorman threatened to call security." Her voice shook, but her eyes never left his. "You weren't just unavailable, you were gone. I was left with nothing but this necklace and a baby who deserved better than me begging for change." Her words crashed into him, each one tearing open old wounds he hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Guilt, sharp and suffocating, pressed against his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The child, Ethan, fussed against Olivia's chest, reaching his small hand upward until his fingers brushed her jaw. Instantly, her fury melted into tenderness. She kissed his forehead and whispered, reassurances, her voice breaking into a soft lullaby that silenced the boy's cries. Alexander watched, mesmerized. He had seen her strength before, but never the fierce, unyielding love of a mother. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Alexander Richardson faced something he could neither predict, nor purchase, nor plan his way through. On this cold December night, the empire he had built seemed fragile compared to the fragile hand that had just reached for him. And for the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. The snow had begun to fall harder, little flakes catching in Olivia's dark hair, clinging to the wool of Alexander's coat, dotting Ethan's blanket like tiny white stars. For a long, agonizing moment, the three of them stood on that frozen sidewalk to people bound by a history too painful to speak, and a child who knew nothing of the storm swirling around him. The city moved on, indifferently, taxis speeding by, couples laughing as they rushed into the warm glow of the restaurant behind him. But for Alexander, time had slowed to something unbearable. His life, once an endless march of scheduled perfection, now spun out of control. "Come inside," he said at last, forcing his voice into something softer, almost pleading. He gestured toward Liren, its golden door swinging open and closed as patrons filed in. "It's warm in there. Let me get you both something to eat. We can talk." Olivia shook her head so sharply it startled him. "I don't belong in places like that anymore." Her words cut deeper than any rejection from a boardroom or investor ever had. He looked at her thin frame, at the child pressing his cheek into her collarbone, and something inside him cracked open. For years, he had believed wealth was protection, power was security, and strategy was salvation. Now, standing in front of the woman he had once loved and the child who bore his blood, he realized how false those beliefs were. "My car." Then, he tried again. "It'll be here any minute. Please, Olivia, just talk to me." She hesitated, torn between distrust and exhaustion. Her eyes flicked down the street, as though calculating escape, but when Ethan whimpered against the cold, she surrendered with a reluctant nod. Almost on cue, his black Bentley slid to the curb. The driver's eyes widened briefly at the sight of Olivia and her child, but returned quickly to the mask of professional indifference. When Alexander shot him a warning glance, he opened the door, and Olivia stepped inside, clutching Ethan tightly. Alexander followed, the leather seats creaking under his weight. The silence inside the car was suffocating. Only Ethan's soft coos filled the space as he batted at the chrome buckle of his mother's coat. Alexander's gaze kept drifting to the child, unable to reconcile the impossibility before him. Every feature spoke of truth: the eyes, the chin, even the way the boy's brow furrowed in concentration. His son, his flesh and blood. And yet he had known nothing. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. Alexander didn't hesitate. "The Westfield Cafe, 3 blocks down." He chose deliberately not the gleaming restaurant where Olivia would feel out of place, but a modest cafe, quiet enough for conversation. As the car pulled away from the curb, Alexander couldn't stop staring at Ethan. The boy was inspecting the leather interior with wide-eyed fascination, running his tiny fingers over the stitching as though memorizing every detail. Those eyes, those unmistakable Richardson eyes, stole every word Alexander thought he might say. He forced himself to look away, to gather his thoughts, but memories assaulted him. The first time he met Olivia 3 years ago at the Metropolitan Museum Gala, she had been fiery and brilliant, challenging his donation priorities, insisting the money should go toward community programs rather than another wing bearing his name. He had been captivated by her courage, her refusal to be awed by his wealth, and now the same courage had carried her through hell without him. "You're staring," Olivia said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I'm trying to understand," Alexander admitted, his voice rougher than he intended. "How I have a son I never knew about." Her jaw tightened. 20 months, she corrected quietly. "He's 20 months old." The timeline clicked into place with brutal precision. Their final argument, the 6-week business trip to Asia, her tearful demand for commitment, his cold dismissal. He remembered leaving for the airport, convinced she would still be waiting when he returned. He had been wrong. She hadn't been waiting at all. She had been carrying his child. "You were pregnant when you left." "Yes." Her voice was flat, stripped of emotion. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question burst from him, sharper than he meant. Her bitter laugh filled the car. "I tried, Alexander, for weeks. I called your office. Your assistant said you were unavailable. Beijing, Dubai, Zurich, always somewhere else. Always out of reach. I stood outside your building in the rain when I was 7 months pregnant. Do you know what happened? Your doorman threatened to call security. The words hit him harder than any hostile takeover or market crash ever could. He remembered that week. He remembered being in Zurich, closing a deal he thought would define his legacy. And all the while, Olivia had been fighting alone, shivering. In the rain with his unborn child inside her, the cafe appeared outside the window, glowing warmly against the night. The car rolled to a stop, but neither of them moved to exit. When did it get this bad? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia looked down at Ethan, who had drifted into a doze against her chest. After he was born, the museum had already let me go by then. They said budget cuts, but it was really the pregnancy. No one hires a woman with no address and a baby on the way. Shelters turned us away when they were full. Do you know what it's like to sit in an emergency room for 6 hours with a feverish infant, completely alone, to choose between diapers and dinner? Alexander shut his eyes. He thought of his penthouse, 10,000 square feet of marble and glass, 5 bedrooms that sat empty night after night, while his son slept in shelters. He thought of the crib his mother had sent, still pristine and unused in a guest room. He thought of the necklace his grandmother's necklace that Olivia had kept instead of selling. Why didn't you sell it? He asked suddenly, his eyes fixed on the pearls. Her hand instinctively rose to them. Because it was the last piece of you, and I wanted Ethan to have something of his heritage, even if you were never in his life. Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time in years, Alexander Richardson felt the weight of his empire collapse, under something far heavier than business. It was guilt, regret, and a terrifying realization that the only thing in his life that truly mattered had almost slipped away forever. The driver cleared his throat gently. Sir, the cafe? Alexander opened his eyes, staring at Olivia, at Ethan in the dim light. For once in his life, he had no strategy, no plan, no certainty, just the gnawing sense that if he didn't act now, he would lose them both again, inside. He said finally, his voice trembling with something unfamiliar. Let's go inside, and this time, I'm not letting you walk away. The bell above the cafe door jingled as Alexander held it open, the warm air rushing over them like a gentle wave after the punishing cold outside. The space was modest, nothing like the polished opulence he was used to. Wooden tables with mismatched chairs, the smell of strong coffee and buttered croissants, the faint hum of a jazz station playing through an old radio. A couple of night shift workers hunched over mugs at the counter, and a waitress wiped down a booth in the corner. It was a place for ordinary lives, for conversations that weren't measured in billions. Olivia slid into the booth, clutching Ethan as if she were bracing against the world. Alexander sat opposite, his towering presence filling the small space. He was used to commanding rooms with his silence, but here, across from her, he felt stripped of authority. He was no longer Alexander Richardson, the man Forbes profiled as one of the most unshakable figures in global business. Here, he was just a man who had missed 20 months of his son's life. The waitress arrived with 2 steaming mugs of coffee and a plate of pastries. Olivia shook her head at them, her pride rigid. But Alexander slid the plate toward her gently. It's not charity, he said softly. It's food. Please. Her eyes lingered on the plate, torn between hunger and resistance. At last, she broke off a small piece of croissant and handed it to Ethan. The boy's face lit up, his tiny fingers clutching the bread, his giggle filling the cafe with a sound that pierced straight through Alexander's chest. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Alexander asked, his voice hushed, though every syllable carried the weight of 2 years. I told you, she whispered, eyes fixed on Ethan. I tried. 13 times. I even counted. Your assistant started recognizing my voice. The last time, she told me not to call again. Alexander's jaw clenched. He saw Claire's face in his mind, his longtime assistant, who had kept his schedule airtight, who prided herself on filtering distractions. She must have thought she was protecting him. In truth, she had walled him off from the only thing that could have saved him from the emptiness he had mistaken for success. I never knew, he said, almost pleading. If I had, would it have mattered? She cut in sharply, her eyes finally lifting to meet his. Would you have dropped Tokyo, Dubai, Zurich? You called those trips the most critical phase of your expansion. Do you know what that meant to me? It meant I wasn't critical, not to you. The words landed like blows, but he didn't fight them. They were true. He had been blind. Ethan squirmed, reaching for the napkin on the table. Alexander instinctively reached to pick it up, their hands brushing. The contact was brief, but it froze both of them. For an instant, the walls of anger and pride collapsed, and the ghosts of who they once were flickered back into existence. What do you want from me now? Alexander asked quietly, afraid of the answer. Money, a place to stay. Her laugh was hollow. I don't want anything from you. If fate hadn't dragged us onto the same sidewalk tonight, you'd still be in Lyran celebrating another acquisition while your son shivered outside. He's my son, mine, a son you never knew existed until an hour ago. The accusation sliced him open. Because you kept him from me, because you made yourself unreachable. Her voice cracked. Do you know what it's like to hold a feverish infant alone in her at 2 a.m, to choose between diapers and dinner, to be turned away from shelters because they're overcrowded? Each question was a knife. He had been in boardrooms when she was in waiting rooms. He had signed billion-dollar contracts while she begged strangers for food, and the child his child had suffered because of him. I didn't know. He whispered, the words trembling. No, she said coldly, you didn't. Silence pressed in around them. Ethan, oblivious to the storm, reached across the table, his tiny hand clutching Alexander's finger with surprising strength. That simple, innocent touch shattered the distance between them. Alexander's throat tightened, his vision blurring. His empire, his wealth, his calculated precision, all of it meant nothing compared to this small hand gripping his. What happens now? He asked, his voice breaking. I don't know. Olivia's eyes softened briefly, but her body remained tense, defensive. This wasn't part of my plan. For the first time in his life, Alexander Richardson, master strategist, realized he was facing something he couldn't calculate. No profit margins, no projected growth, no carefully laid out blueprint, just uncertainty. And for once, uncertainty didn't terrify him. It felt like possibility. When they stepped out of the cafe into the bitter night, snowflakes catching in the street lamps like falling stars, Alexander didn't reach for his phone. He didn't check his watch. He didn't think of the deal waiting for him in Hong Kong or the investors demanding his attention. He looked only at Olivia, her jaw set against the cold, and Ethan, his son, nestled against her shoulder. Come with me, Alexander said, his voice quiet but firm. Just for tonight. You'll be safe. Ethan will be warm. That's all I'm asking. Olivia hesitated, her pride a shield she refused to lower, but Ethan stirred restlessly, his tiny body trembling in the wind. She exhaled a long, weary breath and gave the smallest of nods. Alexander opened the car door, and as she stepped inside, he knew the moment carried more weight than any acquisition he had ever made. Tonight, for the first time in his carefully constructed life, he wasn't chasing profit or prestige. He was chasing redemption. The Bentley purred through the city streets, cutting through the storm like a sleek shadow. From the back seat, Alexander couldn't take his eyes off Olivia and Ethan. The boy had finally drifted into a deeper sleep, his small head resting against her shoulder, one chubby hand still clutching the frayed ear of a worn teddy bear. That toy patched, dirty, clearly well-loved was probably the only constant in Ethan's young life. The sight of it filled Alexander with something he couldn't name, something sharp and aching that lodged itself in his chest. He glanced at Olivia. Her posture was rigid, her eyes fixed on the window, jaw clenched as if she were bracing for another battle. The cafe had given her warmth and food, but not peace. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The car slid into the underground garage of his building, the kind of fortress most people never even saw. Security personnel snapped to attention as the vehicle approached, their eyes flickering briefly to Olivia and Ethan before returning to their rehearsed professionalism. When the elevator doors opened directly into his penthouse foyer, Olivia's sharp intake of breath was audible. The space stretched before her like something out of a design magazine, glass walls framing the skyline, polished stone floors, modern art displayed like trophies. Everything screamed wealth, power, perfection, but to her, Alexander realized it probably screamed cold and personal, a showpiece built to impress investors, not shelter a family. This way, Alexander said, his voice quieter than usual, leading her down a hallway lined with abstract paintings worth more than most homes. He opened the door to a guest suite, The lights flickered on, illuminating a room with pristine white bedding, sleek furniture, and in the corner, something that made Olivia stop in her tracks, a crib dot. It was carved from wood, hand-painted with delicate detail and heirloom piece that looked wildly out of place in the sterile penthouse. "Why do you have a crib?" she asked, her voice low, almost suspicious. Heat crept into his face, an unfamiliar feeling for a man who commanded boardrooms without flinching. "My mother," he admitted. "She had it delivered last year, said I wasn't getting any younger, that it was time I thought about continuing the Richardson line." He gave a humorless laugh. "I never had the heart to send it back." The irony hung heavy in the air. His mother had been preparing for a grandchild who already existed, sleeping in shelters. While this crib sat untouched in his guest room, Olivia laid Ethan gently on the bed instead, surrounding him with pillows to keep him safe. The boy clutched his teddy bear close, sighing softly in his sleep. Alexander stood in the doorway, unable to look away. 20 months of smiles, of tears, of first steps and first words, all stolen from him. "I'll have food sent up," Alexander said finally, backing away. "Clothes, whatever you need." Olivia's voice stopped him cold. "What are you doing, Alexander?" He turned, caught off guard. "Helping you." "No." Her eyes burned into him, sharp as the night they had first met at the museum gala. "This," she gestured between them, between Ethan asleep on the bed and Alexander standing like a guilty intruder. "You're trying to play house, acting like we can just pick up after 2 years, as if nothing happened, as if money and a room can fix it." Her words struck deep because they were true. That was his pattern. Problems were things to be purchased, solutions to be acquired. He had done it his entire life, but this wasn't something he could buy. "He's my son," Alexander said, his voice hoarse. "And I'm what?" Olivia shot back. "Your ex, the woman who disappeared. A charity case you can soothe your conscience with." He shook his head, the truth spilling out before he could stop it. "You're the woman I never stopped thinking about, even when I tried to convince myself I had." The silence that followed was raw, heavy with all the things they'd never said, all the things lost between them. Olivia's eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but she looked away quickly, rebuilding her walls. "One night," she said, firmly. "We'll stay one night. Tomorrow, we figure out something else." Alexander nodded slowly. He knew better than to push, but as he turned back down the hall, his gaze lingered on the sleeping boy, his son, and the ache in his chest sharpened. He had missed everything that mattered. In his cavernous living room, he poured himself a glass of scotch, staring out at the glittering city below. The skyline stretched like a crown of light, every building a monument to his power. Yet tonight, it all looked meaningless, hollow. For the first time in his life, the empire he had sacrificed everything to build felt like a gilded cage. The sound of soft footsteps made him turn. Olivia stood in the doorway, arms folded, her eyes reflecting both weariness and steel. "You're good at making deals, Alexander, but this, it's not a negotiation you can win." He set the glass down, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "Then it's the first deal in my life worth losing." Her lips parted slightly, caught off guard by the honesty. For a moment, the icy air between them cracked, the faintest warmth slipping through. Then she turned away, disappearing back into the guest room. Alexander stood alone, the city's glow spilling across his face, and realized that his empire had taught him everything about power, yet nothing about what truly mattered. And for the first time in years, he felt the ground shifting beneath him, carrying him toward a future he couldn't control. The pale light of morning crept across the penthouse windows, chasing away the Manhattan skyline's glitter and replacing it with something harsher, something real. Alexander was already awake, though he hadn't really slept. He sat in a chair at the far end of the living room, his phone in one hand, staring at the black screen as though daring it to buzz. For years, his mornings had begun with emails from Tokyo, calls with Zurich, strategy sessions before sunrise. This morning, all he could hear was the faint rustle of movement down the hall and the small, drowsy murmur of a child's voice. Olivia emerged first, her hair loosely tied back, exhaustion painted across her features, but still carrying herself with the quiet dignity that had once drawn him in so completely. Behind her toddled Ethan, clutching his battered teddy in one hand and wobbling slightly as he made his way into the vast living room. The boy looked so small against the cavernous space, Yet somehow he owned it in a way Alexander never had. "Banana," Ethan announced, as though issuing a command to the universe. Olivia managed a faint smile. "We'll see what your host keeps." In that refrigerator, she crossed to the kitchen and began searching. Alexander rose, setting the phone down deliberately as if it weighed more than steel. And joined them, the fridge was embarrassingly empty bottled water. A few containers of gourmet leftovers from Liren, expensive champagne, but nothing resembling food a child could eat. Olivia frowned, her hand lingering on a sleek glass shelf. "I've never seen a kitchen so big and so useless," she said. Alexander, caught between shame and a sudden desire to fix everything at once, began to stammer an explanation, but before he could, Olivia found a small basket tucked in the corner. "Bananas," she said softly, lifting one. "Your housekeeper must have left them." She peeled it and handed slices to Ethan, who plopped into a chair and devoured them with messy determination. When the boy noticed Alexander watching, he grinned and extended a sticky piece with pride. "Papa," he said casually, as if he had always known. The word punched the air out of Alexander's lungs. His hands trembled as he accepted the offering. The smear of fruit against his sleeve, an almost sacred stain. "He called me. It's the first time," Olivia confirmed quietly, her gaze softening despite herself. Alexander sank into the chair opposite Ethan, overwhelmed. He had signed contracts worth billions with a steady hand. But this being, called Papa by a boy who had lived 20 months without him, was a deal. He had no idea how to navigate. His phone buzzed violently against the counter, shattering the fragile stillness. Alexander looked at it, saw the caller ID, Hong Kong, the deal, the one his board had been pushing toward for months. His old instinct screamed at him to answer, to protect the empire. But then Ethan laughed, an innocent, bubbling sound, and smacked his banana-covered hand on the table, demanding more. For the first time in his career, Alexander reached over, picked up the phone, and powered it off. "You didn't have to," Olivia began. "Yes, I did," he interrupted, his voice steady, almost defiant. "I've missed enough already." The rest of the morning unfolded like something out of a life he had never known he wanted. Ethan toddled around the living room, turning the polished marble floors into a playground. Alexander, still in his tailored suit, found himself on his knees with toy cars Olivia pulled from her worn bag, listening intently as his son babbled half-words. When Ethan stumbled into his lap, squealing with triumph, Alexander felt something in his chest tear open a crack in the armor he had spent decades building. But with the sweetness came friction. Later, as Olivia watched Alexander struggle with Ethan's diaper tabs, her voice was calm but firm. "This is what it's like, Alexander. It's not just laughter and smiles. It's patience, frustration, exhaustion. And it doesn't stop when the phone rings." He looked up, guilt threading through him. "I want to be here. Not just today. Not just for show. I want to be part of his life." Olivia folded her arms, studying him carefully. "I don't want your money," she said. "I don't want him growing up as another line item in Richardson Industries' ledger. If you're going to be in his life, you need to be present. Really present. Do you understand what that means?" Alexander met her eyes, unflinching. "It means every meeting, every deal, every expansion comes second." The word shocked even him. He had never placed anything second to his empire. And yet, saying it now felt right, like breathing after years of suffocation. The test came sooner than he expected. His phone switched back on that afternoon, lit up with messages, urgent board meetings, investors demanding clarity, whispers of collapse if he didn't fly to Hong Kong immediately. The future of his empire dangled in the balance, and yet when Ethan tugged on his sleeve, holding up a pictured book and babbling, "Read, Papa," Alexander made his choice. He slid the phone into his pocket, unopened, and pulled his son into his lap. His voice cracked as he stumbled through the simple story. But Ethan listened with rapt attention, his tiny hand resting trustingly against Alexander's chest. Olivia stood at the kitchen counter, watching. She didn't speak, but something flickered in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faintest spark of possibility for Alexander Richardson. The man who wants to find himself by mergers and acquisitions. The real acquisition was unfolding, here, in the laughter of a child and the wary, watchful eyes of the woman he had failed. And for the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't afraid to lose everything, because now he finally understood what was worth fighting for. The city stretched beneath him like a glittering circuit board, humming with power. But Alexander Richardson felt none of it. He stood at the window of the boardroom, 30 stories above Manhattan, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but inside, he was a storm. For the first time in his life, his empire felt fragile not because of market trends or hostile competitors, but because of the decision waiting before him died behind him. The voices of his board filled the air, sharp and insistent. Mr. Richardson, if we don't move now, Langford Holdings will snatch the deal in Hong Kong right out from under us. Years of groundwork, billions in positioning this is the crown jewel of the empire. You've built Richardson Industries on being decisive, ruthless. Don't waver now. Their words clashed like swords, the old language of power and conquest. But Alexander no longer heard strategy, he heard desperation. They were men and women trying to protect numbers on screens, while in his mind he saw only Ethan's smile. Olivia's tired but defiant gaze, the warmth of a small sticky hand clutching his finger. He turned, finally, letting his eyes sweep over the table. The faces were familiar, loyal, hungry, ambitious, but they looked different to him now. Once, he had believed they were his family. Now he knew better. I've considered the Hong Kong expansion. Alexander began, his voice low but steady. Instantly, the room silenced. He was their axis, the force they revolved around. It's brilliant, profitable, exactly the kind of deal I would have chased without hesitation. A few board members leaned forward, already smiling. They thought they knew where this was going. But it's not the kind of deal I will chase. Anymore. The smiles froze. Confusion rippled across the table. One man laughed nervously, certain he'd misheard. Sir, you mean you'll renegotiate? Delay until we... No. Alexander's voice cut through like a blade. I mean, we're walking away. The room erupted. Papers rustled. Voices overlapped. Outrage and disbelief clattering like gunfire. Walk away. This is lunacy. You'll tank the company's reputation. Investors will revolt. Alexander slammed his hand against the polished mahogany table, and the room fell into stunned silence. He rarely lost composure. His restraint had always been his deadliest weapon, but now his restraint had limits. I've spent my life believing. Legacy was measured in skyscrapers and market shares, he said, his tone raw, unpolished. I built this empire to last beyond me, to prove I was more than the boy who grew up watching his father chase shadows of power. But do you know what I've learned? He looked each of them in the eye, forcing them to meet the storm in his gaze. An empire means nothing if the man behind it dies alone. Whispers rose, stunned and uncertain. My grandmother gave me a necklace once, he continued, his voice softening but cutting even deeper. She said it was meant for family, for continuity, for love. I dismissed it. I thought money would outlive me better than pearls ever could. But last week, I found that necklace on the neck of a woman I loved and lost, and in her arms was my son. The confession sucked the air from the room. No one had expected him to bear something so personal, so vulnerable. I have a son, Alexander repeated, his throat tight. A child who will not remember how many companies I acquired, but who will know if I was there when he needed me. That is my legacy. Not Hong Kong, not Langford Holdings, him. He straightened, drawing on the steel that had once built his empire, now repurposed for something greater. So if you want a leader who will sacrifice everything for numbers on a balance sheet, find someone else. I'm done. Silence crashed over the boardroom. Some stared in horror, others in awe. For the first time, Alexander Richardson wasn't the man they thought they knew. He was something far more dangerous, someone who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. When he walked out, the city's hum felt different, louder. For years, the skyline had seemed like a monument to his achievements. Now it was simply a backdrop to the only story that mattered. He returned home that evening to find Olivia in the guest suite, folding Ethan's tiny clothes with quiet precision. She looked up, her expression wary, braced for disappointment. Well, she asked. Alexander knelt on the floor beside Ethan, who was babbling to his teddy bear. I told them no. Olivia blinked. You walked away from the deal. He nodded, lifting Ethan into his arms. The boy's laughter rang out, bright and unburdened, and for the first time Alexander felt what power truly was. Not domination, not wealth, but this being present, being needed, being loved. Why? Olivia asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. He met her eyes, his voice steady and sure. Because I've been chasing the wrong inheritance. This. He kissed Ethan's head. This is the only one that matters. Olivia's composure wavered, her walls cracking under the weight of his words. She stepped closer, her hand brushing the necklace at her throat, the one that had brought them back together. I almost sold it that night, she whispered. If I had, you never would have stopped. You never would have seen us. Alexander's chest tightened as the truth sank in. Their entire future had hung on that one fragile thread of fate, a single desperate choice in the cold December night. He pulled her closer, his son between them, and for the first time in decades, Alexander Richardson's empire was not measured in towers of glass and steel, but in the warmth of the family. He had almost lost forever, and it was the only empire worth ruling.